The emergency room was buzzing with activity, a constant hum of nurses and doctors rushing through the corridors, tending to patients. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the urgency of the day's work. Dr. Jamal Carter, a renowned black surgeon known for his exceptional skill and calm under pressure, stepped into the waiting area, scanning patient charts. His reputation was stellar, and he was the kind of doctor who worked tirelessly, often going above and beyond for his patients. He adjusted his white coat as he moved through the room, unaware of the scene unfolding just ahead. Suddenly, a loud, piercing voice cut through the busy ER like a knife. "This is taking too long," Karen's voice echoed, filling the space with anger. "I want a real doctor." Dr. Carter paused, glancing toward the front desk. A middle-aged white woman, Karen, stood there with her arms crossed, her face twisted in frustration. The nurse at the desk, trying to diffuse the tension, spoke softly, but firmly. "Ma'am, please have a seat. The doctor will be with you shortly." But Karen wasn't having it. She slammed her purse onto the counter with a thud, her voice rising in indignation. "I don't want some intern. I need a real, qualified doctor," she snapped, her tone dripping with condescension. Dr. Carter, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward. He adjusted his coat, his expression calm, despite the growing tension in the room. He had seen moments like this before, and he knew how to handle them. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Carter," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "How can I help you?" Karen turned to face him, eyeing him up and down with a sneer. Her eyes widened briefly, taking in his dark skin and professional demeanor. The moment of recognition barely registered before the words slipped out of her mouth. "You're the doctor?" She laughed, incredulity in her voice. "Oh, please, get me someone else." The words hung in the air, heavy with entitlement and prejudice. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Karen, waiting to see how Dr. Carter would respond. The nurse, still behind the desk, looked worried but said nothing, unsure of how to intervene. The tension in the ER thickened, but Dr. Carter remained unshaken. The waiting room went completely silent. The tension in the air was palpable as all eyes turned to Karen and Dr. Carter. Every conversation halted, and even the usually busy nurses and staff couldn't help but notice the confrontation unfolding. Dr. Carter stood tall, his expression calm but firm. He had seen racism before, and he had dealt with it with grace countless times, but it didn't make moments like these any easier. Despite the anger bubbling inside him, he maintained control of his emotions. "Ma'am," Dr. Carter said, his voice unwavering, "I assure you, I am more than qualified to treat you." Karen scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Yeah, right," she sneered. "Look at you. What are you, some kind of trainee?" She crossed her arms, her tone dripping with disdain. The nurse at the front desk stiffened, standing up straighter. She couldn't let this continue any longer. "Dr. Carter is one of the best surgeons in the state," she said firmly, her voice clear and unyielding. Karen didn't seem to care, though. She let out a loud, mocking laugh that filled the room. "Oh, this is rich!" she exclaimed, her voice thick with sarcasm. "What? Did you get a diversity hire quota to fill?" The room froze. A few patients gasped in shock, clearly appalled by her words. A young mother clutching her child whispered under her breath, "That's not okay." Even the nurse behind the desk seemed shocked, her face flushed with anger. But no one spoke out, unsure of how to handle the situation. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, his mind momentarily racing as he absorbed Karen's words. He could feel the injustice, the unfairness, the discrimination, but he also understood that now wasn't the time to react with anger. He had a job to do, and his dignity mattered more than anything. He stood his ground, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Ma'am, if you don't want my help, you're free to leave." Karen's eyes flashed with anger and she scoffed again. "You know what? I will." she shot back, turning to storm out of the room. I'll go to a hospital that hires real doctors. She turned on her heel, preparing to walk out in a huff, but then she paused. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced over at the large doctor board on the wall, listing all the doctors who worked at the hospital. It was a stark, imposing board featuring the names of everyone from general practitioners to specialists, with each doctor's credentials listed underneath. Karen's eyes scanned the names, and her face suddenly froze. Her gaze lingered on one name in particular, Dr. Jamal Carter, the head of surgery. Her confidence faltered, and the anger that had been so clear on her face melted into disbelief. It was the same name, the very same name that had been spoken just moments ago by Dr. Carter himself. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped back, her eyes wide, as if the realization was just beginning to sink in. The room had fallen completely silent, as everyone knew exactly what was happening. They watched as Karen's smug expression began to fade, replaced by something much less confident: embarrassment. She turned back slowly, her face flushing red with shame. You're really Dr. Carter? Karen stammered, her voice now much softer, almost apologetic. Dr. Carter's expression remained unchanged. He didn't take pleasure in her discomfort, but he also wasn't about to let this moment pass without some acknowledgement. He stood tall, his posture poised, as he met her gaze directly. Yes, he replied calmly. I am. And I'm more than capable of helping you if you're willing to accept my care. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked around, her eyes darting nervously as she realized just how many people had witnessed her behavior. The young mother who had whispered earlier now exchanged looks with the nurse behind the desk, both of them nodding in quiet approval. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Karen looked down, unable to make eye contact with anyone. She could feel the weight of her prejudice, her assumptions, crushing her. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the enormity of her mistake. She had judged a man based on his appearance, assuming that he wasn't qualified, when in fact, he was far more qualified than anyone in the room had ever given her credit for. Dr. Carter's eyes softened, but his tone remained steady. Now, if you'd like, we can get started with your treatment, he offered, his voice carrying a note of professionalism and quiet dignity. He wasn't angry with her. He didn't need to be. He simply wanted to help, as he always did. Karen stood there, frozen for a moment, before she slowly nodded. Her face was a mixture of guilt and hesitation. I'm sorry, she muttered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. Dr. Carter nodded, acknowledging her apology, though he knew that words weren't enough to fix the situation. But in the end, it wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about moving forward. Apology accepted, he said simply. And with that, the tension in the room finally began to dissipate. Karen took a deep breath, and the room's attention shifted back to its original purpose: the patients in need of care, the staff working tirelessly to provide it, and Dr. Carter, standing as a quiet but powerful example of grace under pressure. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served, not in anger, but in dignity. Karen's smirk began to fade as she stared at the doctor board on the wall. Her eyes slowly moved across the names, searching for the one she had so casually dismissed moments earlier. The board was lined with doctors, each with their credentials listed beside their names. But when her gaze landed on one name in particular, her heart skipped a beat. Head of Surgery, Dr. Jamal Carter, M.D., F.A.C.S. Her face drained of color, her jaw slackening in disbelief. No way, she whispered to herself. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the board, trying to process the information. Her eyes slowly moved from the name on the board back to Dr. Carter, who was still standing there, watching her intently. And that's when it hit her. She hadn't even noticed his name tag until now. Karen's breath caught in her throat as she read the words on the tag. Dr. Jamal Carter, Chief of Surgery. Her hands started to shake. She blinked rapidly, trying to comprehend what was happening. The realization washed over her in waves, and she felt a sinking feeling in her stomach as she understood the enormity of her mistake. You're the head of surgery? Karen stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with a mixture of disbelief and fear. Dr. Carter folded his arms across his chest, standing tall and composed. That's right, he replied calmly. And you just insulted the only person who could help you. Karen's eyes flicked around the room. The once muted whispers had grown louder, and now the entire waiting room was watching her. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of her own heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the situation hit her like a freight train. A teenage boy in the back of the room, who had been silently watching the exchange, leaned toward his mother and whispered, loud enough for Karen to hear. That's embarrassing. The words stung more than anything Karen had heard that day. Her face turned an even deeper shade of red as she realized the magnitude of her actions. She had tried to belittle a man, assuming he was just another intern, only to discover he was the highest-ranking surgeon in the hospital. And not just any surgeon, one of the best in the field. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, and for the first time, she wasn't in control. The embarrassment, the shame, all of it overwhelmed her, and she had no idea how to make it right. Dr. Carter stood there, unbothered by her silence. His posture remained relaxed, but his presence commanded respect. Is there anything else I can help you with? He asked, his tone calm and professional. Karen's mind raced, but she couldn't form a coherent thought. She wanted to apologize, to say something, anything to undo the damage she had caused, but all that came out was a quiet, defeated, I didn't know. Dr. Carter looked at her for a long moment, the silence hanging between them like an unspoken challenge. He could feel the weight of her regret, but there was no room for leniency in a moment like this. Karen had made her assumptions, treated him with disdain, and now the truth had been laid bare. You didn't know, he replied, his voice steady, but you do now. Karen's hands were still shaking as she looked down, unable to meet his eyes. The realization was settling in, and the weight of her prejudice was now too much to bear. She had been so quick to judge, to assume, and now she had been exposed in front of everyone. She didn't know how to fix it, or if it was even possible to fix. The room was silent, save for the subtle sound of people shuffling, whispering amongst themselves. No one felt sorry for Karen, not anymore. They had all seen her make a fool of herself, and they knew it wasn't going to be something she would live down easily. Karen's face turned pale, her pride shattered. The room around her seemed to spin as she realized the full extent of her actions. She had crossed a line, and now, the consequences of that line had come back to haunt her. Dr. Carter didn't seem angry. He didn't need to be. He had already won, without raising his voice or losing his composure. His quiet authority had spoken volumes, and now Karen was left to reckon with the consequences of her words. With no more words to say, Karen slowly backed away from Dr. Carter, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The reality of the moment was too much for her to handle, and she quickly turned to leave, eager to escape the stares and the quiet murmurs that followed her every step. Dr. Carter, however, didn't look after her. He simply turned and walked toward the front desk, continuing his rounds as if nothing had happened. Because for him, the true power didn't lie in humiliation. It lay in the calm dignity of being who he was, despite the prejudices others tried to impose. And as for Karen, her silence spoke volumes. Karen swallowed hard, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She tried to force a nervous laugh, but it came out strained and hollow. I didn't mean anything by it, doctor, she stammered, her eyes darting around the room, desperate to salvage some semblance of dignity. It was just a little joke. Dr. Carter looked at her with a blank, unwavering stare. The room had gone completely silent, all eyes now fixed on the unfolding scene. His expression didn't change. His gaze was calm and steady, though his silence spoke volumes. A joke? He asked flatly. Karen nodded eagerly, almost pleading with him to understand. Yes, you know, people joke around all the time. She smiled weakly, but her words hung in the air, heavy and awkward. Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow, his expression still unreadable. Interesting, he said slowly, his tone calm but firm. Because I didn't find it funny. The nurse at the desk, who had been quietly observing the exchange, crossed her arms and smirked. Me neither, she added, her voice dripping with quiet satisfaction. Karen's face burned with humiliation as murmurs began to ripple through the room. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension growing with every passing second. The old man in the waiting room, who had been watching the whole time, couldn't help but grin. Karma's real lady, he said with a chuckle, his voice barely audible but enough to make Karen cringe. Karen fidgeted, her discomfort palpable. She looked away, her gaze shifting to the floor as she tried to compose herself. The atmosphere in the room seemed to grow even colder, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. I still need a doctor, she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper, hoping for some sign of mercy. Dr. Carter sighed, shaking his head slightly, his demeanor still calm, but now tinged with disappointment. Ma'am, he said, his voice steady, there are two things I don't tolerate: incompetence and disrespect. Karen's face lit up for a moment, as if she thought he might relent. Her posture straightened, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. So, you'll still treat me? She asked, her voice now tinged with desperation. Dr. Carter's lips curved into a slight smirk, but it wasn't one of kindness. It was a quiet, firm expression of authority. No, he said simply, his tone final. You can wait for the next available doctor. Karen's mouth dropped open in shock, her mind racing as she tried to process his words. She couldn't believe it. He was actually refusing to treat her. The realization hit her harder than she expected, and her face went pale. But, she stammered, trying to speak but failing to find the words. Dr. Carter didn't even glance at her as he turned to the nurse. Next patient, please, he said, his voice calm and unhurried. Karen stood frozen in place, her face now an even deeper shade of red as she realized what had just happened. She was being humiliated, the same way she had humiliated him just moments before, and there was no way for her to escape it. The nurse nodded and called the next patient, completely ignoring Karen, as if she wasn't even standing there. The room had completely shifted in her absence, the atmosphere now charged with a quiet sense of justice. The patients and staff knew exactly what had just transpired, and they weren't about to let Karen slide by unscathed. Karen's body trembled with anger and embarrassment as she watched the next patient walk past her, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room burning into her. She knew she had been bested, and she knew there was no way to undo the damage she had caused. As the moments dragged on, Karen stood there, completely alone in the middle of the ER. Her pride had been shattered, and her attempt to belittle Dr. Carter had only backfired. The once quick and confident woman was now reduced to a shell of her former self, humiliated in front of everyone she had tried to impress. And Dr. Carter? He simply turned back to his work, moving on with his day as if this moment had never even happened. He had proven, without a doubt, that respect was earned, and he didn't need to raise his voice to teach that lesson. Karen slunk into the corner of the waiting room, her face flushed with embarrassment. She avoided eye contact with everyone around her, her posture hunched as she tried to disappear into the background. She knew she had lost, lost not just the argument, but any semblance of dignity. The murmurs of the room faded into the background as she fidgeted in her seat, feeling the weight of her actions like a heavy stone in her stomach. Meanwhile, Dr. Carter walked with quiet confidence down the hallway. He entered a patient's room, greeted by smiles and respect from the nursing staff and the patients he attended to. His professionalism was undeniable, his reputation for skill and kindness clear to everyone in the hospital. With every step, he reinforced his authority, but not through force, only through calm, steady competence. In another part of the waiting room, a young black girl sat with her mother. The little girl's wide eyes followed Dr. Carter as he walked by, a look of admiration on her face. She turned to her mom, a spark of inspiration in her voice. "I want to be a doctor like him," she whispered, her voice filled with hope and awe. The mother smiled down at her daughter, her eyes filled with pride and encouragement. She gently patted her child's head. "You can, sweetheart. You absolutely can," she said, her voice soft but firm with belief. The scene in the waiting room contrasted sharply with the earlier tension. Karen's negativity, her assumptions, and her disrespect were now nothing more than background noise. The space was filled with something much stronger, the quiet power of respect, the example of grace under pressure, and the quiet, inspiring presence of a black doctor who refused to let racism define him. And as the little girl's eyes shone with admiration, the message was clear. The future belonged to those who earned respect, not those who tried to claim it through prejudice. Dr. Carter had shown them that,